I have related how the King of Naples had made up his mind to act on the offensive. The Austrian manifesto had been published in the official Gazette of Vienna, and war had broken out between the two states. Each day, different reports were current as to the march of the Neapolitan troops, as well as to the advantages which had not been obtained by the Austrian army. These reports kept all minds in suspense. The events of this campaign excited the greatest interest, especially at Schönbrunn. Archduke Rainier came to see the Empress one day and informed her that General Neipperg had marched 5,000 men against a corps of Neapolitan troops near Medina, that he had defeated them and had taken 800 prisoners, that he had taken the fort of Carpi by surprise and captured it with his cavalry alone. This ranking with General Lassalle's feat of arms at the taking of Stettin during the Jena campaign. Finally, it was said that after several fruitless attacks on Ochobello to force a crossing over the Po, King Joachim had been obliged to retreat. Such were the reports which were circulating in Vienna during the whole month of April. Before relating the sad issue of the struggle which the King of Naples had entered upon with Austria, I must throw a retrospective glance on the cause which decided the unhappy Murat to take so desperate a resolution. After having left the French army in Posen on January 16th, 1813, the king immediately returned to Naples. He felt that his crown would be in danger by the consequence of the failure of the war against Russia. He lent his ear to the insinuating proposals made to him by Austria. Austria maintains that Joachim took the initiative. Pourparlers took place with the English general William Bentinck. The king offered, without the emperor's sanction, to do so to mediate between France and hostile powers. However, the remembrance of the glory which he had won under the French flag, the feeling of what he owed to the country where he had been born and raised to a high rank, his gratitude to and attachment for Napoleon brought him back into the midst of his brothers in arms during the 1813 campaign. The fatal project which he had been turning over in his mind so long a time past, and to which a new impetus was given by the Battle of Leipzig, recalled him a second time to Italy. At Erfurt, he took what was to be a last farewell of the emperor and then returned to Naples. He was more than ever convinced that Napoleon's power was shaken to its foundation and that it would not be long before he would succumb without any possibility of saving him. The Neapolitans, who had King Joachim's confidence, maintained him in this way of thinking by false or true reports, which contributed to lead him astray. Fouché's advice finally persuaded him that the time had come at last when he must separate his fortunes from Napoleon. This calculation was based on a principle which proceeded from a feeling of generosity, which calls for indulgence and diminishes the culpability of his desertion. He had said to himself that if he, the King of Naples, the only remaining ally remaining to Napoleon, were to be dragged down with Napoleon in a common fall, all hope would be forever lost, but that if, on the contrary, he remained standing on the ruins of the empire, he would have a chance of being useful to his benefactor and of being able to hold out his hand to him. The splendor of such a role dazzled him. It must be admitted also that a less chivalrous motive had a great influence on his determination. He had learnt as a fact, and supposed friends had assured him of it, that it was Napoleon's intention to incorporate the state of Naples into the Kingdom of Italy. According to these rumors, it was proposed to offer the dethroned monarch an indemnity, which, no matter how great it might be, would not be an equivalent to the crown of Naples, a crown which he hoped to transmit to his children. Murat had, accordingly, come to the conclusion that his throne would not be in safety so long as Napoleon's rule maintained preponderant in Italy. It was thus that he was brought to re-enter upon negotiations, which he now approached without the same advantages on his side as formerly. On January 11th, 1814, after a violent struggle between his good and evil genius, Murat signed an offensive and defensive alliance with Austria, who went surety for her allies. By this treaty, Joachim engaged to pursue the war against France, assisted by the united efforts of the Allied powers in the reestablishment of a fair balance of power, and to assure peace to Europe, and particularly to Italy, where the two contracting states mutually guaranteed each other's possessions. The avowed object of this treaty was to limit Napoleon's empire to the Alps, the Rhine, and the Pyrenees. But Joachim, trusting in the apparent force of the bonds which attached the Austrian emperor to Napoleon's family, could not imagine that the war against France would be transformed into a personal war against the daughter of the said emperor of Austria, against his son-in-law and his grandson. General Neipperg, Prince Metternich's great agent in seduction, was sent to Naples to conclude this treaty. Lord W. Bentinck arrived in Naples at the same time and signed a convention with the Neapolitan government, which was simply entitled an armistice, but which proclaimed the state of Naples as at peace with England. Free communication was reestablished between the two states, and the ports of both countries were reciprocally open to trade, whilst the Neapolitan flag was acknowledged and protected by England. The covenant, concluded with General Bentinck, was considered as being virtually of the same strength as a treaty and was reserved for a signature on a future occasion, it having been recognized as necessary not to lose any time in deciding on the plan of the campaign which the Austrian, English, and Neapolitan troops were to take part. Lord Aberdeen was to receive the full necessary powers for the conclusion of a definite treaty at a subsequent period. The convention was the preliminary of this treaty. One of the articles of this convention stipulated that in case any unforeseen event stood in the way of its ratification, the two parties undertook not to recommence hostilities before having given each other due preliminary notification. We shall see lower down with what object this clause was inserted. The promise of a definite treaty was never concluded. The English government, whose good faith was with good reason open to suspicion, having alleged that if it put off concluding this treaty, it was by motives of delicacy and honor, which did not allow it to impose on a prince allied to England, the King of Sicily, a sacrifice of his hereditary states before an indemnity had been paid to him. Letters from Lord Castlereagh containing the engagement to carry out this covenant faithfully were communicated to the king. Thus, the English government had only bound itself towards the King of Naples by a military convention, a convention which the occurrences of war might modify entirely. In the meanwhile, King Joachim, full of confidence, immediately opened the campaign and marched upon Bologna without having the ratification of the treaty with Austria. A variety of circumstances inspired him for a short time with doubts as to the sincerity of his allies. The delay of the Emperor of Austria's ratification showed that there was some hesitation on the part of this prince. The equivocal attitude of Lord Bentinck, who was placed at the head of the Sicilian troops, manifested to the former sovereign of the two Sicilies that these troops were intended to conquer back again the throne which had been usurped at Naples. The summonses addressed to the generals and the officers of King Joachim's army to induce them to pronounce themselves against the reigning dynasty. All these threatening communications troubled King Murat, as well as they might. On another side, the declaration of Sir Robert Wilson, English commissioner with the Austrian army in Italy, charged by Lord Bentinck, as well as by Marshal Belgrade, to dissipate all misunderstanding, tended to reassure the reigning sovereign of Naples. General Wilson, declared to him that he considered Lord Castlereagh's letters containing promises of a formal treaty as documents of a value equal to a treaty itself, and that neither the British government nor any executive authority would hesitate to recognize the validity of such an engagement. In his personal opinion, the English commissioner said this promise was more binding than a regular treaty because it constituted at the same time an appeal to honor and an obligation of good faith. Lord Bentinck himself hastened to King Joachim's headquarters and declared anew that his government fully adhered to the treaty concluded on January 11th between the Emperor of Austria and the King of Naples. He also confirmed England's consent to the advantages stipulated in Murat's favor, that is to say, the cession of the marches of Ancona on condition that the Neapolitan army should give its immediate and active cooperation to the Allies. The non-payment of the indemnity due to the King of Sicily still remained the only alleged cause of delay in the conclusion of a formal and definite treaty. Murat contented himself with these explanations and no longer hesitated, whilst the King of Naples was relying on the good faith of the allies with whom he was making common cause. The ambassador of France at the Congress of Vienna was making every effort to obtain from the Austrian government that they should break off this alliance with Napoleon's brother-in-law. Talleyrand was seconded in his task by the English ambassadors who, hiding their double game, pressed Austria to undertake what they called the holy war of legitimacy against a sovereign with whom this power was bound by a treaty and to whom she had guaranteed the integrity of the states. The Austrian government, whilst listening to these proposals, ensured its final acquiescence, alleging that as an excuse that its finances were exhausted, the English minister offered to dispose of this difficulty by paying the cost of this expedition, and even consented to assist the Austrians in their movements with an English fleet. When King Joachim was informed of these treacherous negotiations, he was either in ignorance of the part which the English ministers had taken in it, or else he closed his eyes against proof. When it became impossible to doubt any longer that he would sooner or later be attacked by Austria, he decided to prepare himself thoroughly to repel any aggression. He entered into communications with the island of Elba and obtained from Napoleon that he would forget what had passed and once more made common cause with him in secret. Whilst this redoubtable adversary of the Allies, leaving the obscure retreat from the depths of which he still made them tremble, went off to reconquer his empire with 1 battalion of his faithful guard, the King of Naples attacked the Austrians and drove them back from position to the banks of the Po. Fickle Fortune, who had so long protected her 2 favorites, luring them on with her last favors, was soon to swallow them up in the abyss. Murat advanced rapidly upon Reggio, having directed his right flank on Occobello and his left on Florence. Pushing his outposts as far as Pistoia, he marched in the direction of Milan, where he was expected, believing that he had only to deal with the Austrians, flattering himself with the thought that the English would not interfere in his quarrel with Austria. He gave satisfaction to the request, which was addressed to him by Lord Bentinck, not to violate the territory of the King of Sardinia, who is England's ally. This condescension on his part was to become fatal to him. Crossing a corner of the Piedmontese territory, Murat could easily have crossed the Po at Piacenza, which was then in a very weak state of defense. He directed his principal efforts against Occobello, which he was unable to carry by storm. His respect for the Sardinian frontier did not preserve him from the discomfiture which a treacherous enemy inflicted upon him in notifying to him that a union of the English forces to the Austrian army had been effected on the pretext that the King of Naples had violated the convention between him and England. A convention, one of the stipulations of which provided that he should not attack them without having given 3 months' notice of his intention to do so. Joachim then repented that he had not remained on the defensive in conformity with his agreement with the Emperor Napoleon, and of having yielded to the repeated and pressing requests which the ambassadors in Vienna and in London had addressed to him to urge him to act on the offensive, not allowing himself to be cast down, however, by a blow which had not altogether taken him by surprise, Joachim undertook to reestablish his forces by means of a decisive act. He assembled his army, which was still of a strength of more than 30,000 men, in a retrenched camp between Ancona and Rimini. 2 days later, he gave a great battle with the Austrians, which lasted 2 days in the plain of Tolentina. The Neapolitan army, weakened and demoralized by previous defeats, succumbed to the force of an enemy numerically superior, in spite of the prodigies of valor of its chief, disbanded, and the greater part cut off by the Austrian troops. Some fell into their power, the rest fled towards Naples, and dispersed in every direction. This retreat would have been perhaps less disastrous had not General Pignatelli Strongoli, who commanded the left wing of the Neapolitan army, prematurely quitted Florence, leaving the road open to Rome to the Austrian general Nugent. Some attribute this disastrous intelligence on the Neapolitan general's part to want of order, others of treachery. This fatal incident, the false reports of Murat's death and of the landing of the English in Naples, the open treachery of certain officers who propagated discouragement and desertion by their speeches and by their example. All these causes together caused a panic in the Neapolitan army. Joachim, abandoned by his people, had nothing left to do but to return to Naples. He arrived there followed by some horsemen. He entered his capital accompanied by Colonel Boniface, his nephew, and 4 lancers. He went straight to the palace, where he appeared before the queen, pale and emaciated, in his lancer's uniform covered with dust. He embraced his wife tenderly and said to her, "All is lost except my life, and I was not fortunate enough to find death." In taking leave of the queen, Caroline, and his children, King Joachim cut his hair, which fell in long ringlets on his shoulders, and putting off his decorations, dressed himself in clothes which did not attract attention. He walked along the coast until he was opposite the island of Nisida, and there got into a boat which landed him on the island of Ischia, where he passed 3 days without being recognized. On the 4th day, as he was walking along the beach accompanied by his faithful nephew, and was deliberating with him on the best means for escaping to France, he noticed a little sailing ship on the east which was approaching them. The king hailed the vessel and, flinging himself into a fishing smack, ordered its owner to go and meet it. What were his surprise and joy when he recognized on board the Duke of Rocca Romana, his grand equerry, and Marquis Giuliani, his aide-de-camp, who had succeeded in escaping from Naples and who were looking for their unfortunate sovereign. The king, before his final departure from Naples, had divided a considerable sum of gold between these 2 officers and had told them of his plan of going to Ischia with his nephew and of embarking there for France. Their meeting, which had been delayed by obstacles, as one can easily understand, having thus fortunately been effected, the king landed in Cannes with his faithful companions towards the end of May 1815, after a crossing which had been disturbed by no incident. During the Odyssey, which we have just related, Queen Caroline had opened negotiations with Lord Exmouth, who was commander of the English fleet before Naples, offering him 2 Neapolitan ships of war on condition that she should be transported to Toulon with her children, whom she had already placed in safety at Gaeta. But Admiral Exmouth, who knew that the ships would be his in any case, refused to receive the queen except to conduct her to Trieste and to place her in the hands of the Austrian authorities. Forced to submit to these humiliating conditions, and having fortunately escaped the effects of a riot, which she quelled by her courage and calmness, Caroline Murat embarked on the English frigate, and making sail for Gaeta, where Napoleon's sister took in her young family, was conducted to Trieste. King Joachim, immediately on landing in Cannes, wrote to Fouché, charging him to speak for him to the emperor and to ask the latter to allow him to go to Paris. Napoleon's only answer was to ask his brother-in-law what treaty of peace had been concluded between France and Naples since 1814. Fouché, in consequence, advised Murat to remain where he was, adding that it was still possible for him to render service to his native country by exciting the inhabitants and the troops of vigorous resistance to the enemies within and without, a kind of service which Murat was never to render, for he had no weight whatever with the French, who did not forget his desertion in 1814. Murat then retired into a little country house in the neighborhood of Toulon.